Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar today for the impact on the public sector of IR35. My name is Matt Lewis. I'm the Director of Hayes Public Services, and I'll be introducing and leading the webinar today. But I'm also joined by Clive Mills, who's very kindly agreed to join us to case study his experience of the implementation of IR35 across Transport for London. Clive is the Recruitment and Redeployment Manager and fundamentally led the implementation of the reform across his organisation. And I'm also joined by Steve Witts, who is the Hayes Group Head of Tax and Treasury. They did a lot of work in the early days of the reform in understanding the implications of the reform and spends a lot of time with our customers in working together to understand how to implement the approach. So, moving on to the agenda, what are we going to cover? The initial element will be around a recap of the IR35 reform itself, what changed and how, that Steve will walk us through. We'll then touch on the market reaction as to how the different sectors of the market, both the customers, the contractors and also agencies responded to the changes, and then Clive will walk us through how he set about organising his organisation around the implementation of the reform. And then Steve will touch on where are we now, post the autumn budget, the implications of the private sector consultation and what that means for us as public sector hirers. And then finally, I will walk through competing for talent, best practice approaches. So what have Clive and others learned about how to implement IR35 reform in order to be able to continue to access that hard-to-find skills, scarce talent. So, moving on. So over to Steve. Let's have a recap, please, if you would, around the reform and how it was implemented.
Thank you, Matt. Hi, everyone. Most of you on the call will have already been dealing with the legislation a little while now, so I will only briefly recap as to the key rules that were introduced back in April 2017. So, fundamentally, the rules apply principally to personal service companies working in the public sector. Question, I guess, what constitutes public sector? And the answer to that being all those bodies who are subject to the Freedom of Information Act. A decision needs to be taken by the public sector authority as to whether a contractor is inside or outside R35. They then need to notify that decision to the relevant person being principally the contractor involved. They can be asked by that contractor why they reached that decision, and the engaging body needs to reply within 31 days, otherwise they become responsible for the operation of PAYE if that PSC contractor falls inside IR35. So a note to everyone there, I guess, is to manage your risk by ensuring that any concerns the personal service worker has and questions that they have for you need to be dealt with swiftly and responsibly. If the worker falls inside IR35, then the organisation paying the contractor, and they can often be recruiters or umbrellas, need to account for PAYE, NIC and employers' NIC, as well as now, recently, apprenticeship levy. If the worker falls outside R35, then, as previously, they can be paid gross. There's an online tool provided by HMRC aimed at aiding the decision-making process. Sadly, it took a long time to actually be created and went through various iterations, and in my opinion and the opinion of the professionals, tax professionals generally, it remains a very blunt instrument to truly identify with any sophisticated degree of accuracy who falls inside and outside. The secondary problem, I guess, about the HMRC online tool, and it's partly a problem created by HMRC, is that lots of engagers rigidly adhere to what they think is an absolute need to use that online tool, when actually there are many other ways of reaching the decision as to whether the contractor falls inside or outside, and the HMRC tool is just one way of doing that. Finally, if the PSC worker falls inside IR35, then he or she needs to be reported on your usual PAYE returns. But again, the organisation that generally pays will be doing that for you. So that was a brief recap of some of the key issues that engagers generally face when looking at the new rules. So what happened in the hiring market since the introduction of the new rules? Well, firstly, some organisations simply stopped hiring PSC workers altogether on the basis that it was just too big a hassle. Some of them continued to hire PSC workers, but insisted on the operation of PAYE by an in-scope blanket determination, which is very quick and simple, but is often an easy way out, and led to problems with contractors themselves. Some applied the rules in testing the PSC workers on an assignment-by-assignment basis, either via the HMRC online testing tool or by external third parties. There are a number of third parties out there who are specialists in this field. As you can imagine, if this is all you do, the sophistication involved in running these tests is, in my view, significantly enhanced, well above the HMRC online tool. Finally, many actually refined and optimized their approach over a period of time. Ultimately, after starting at position 1 or 2, finally falling on 3, where they started critically evaluating each of the workers and what status they had as to whether they were inside or outside IR35.
Thanks, Steve. So what happened elsewhere across the market, in particular across recruitment agencies and contractors? Well, still some 9 months on, many organisations in terms of recruiters struggle with the nuances and the detail of the rules, and indeed often ignore them to some extent. So if you look at, for example, some particular sectors in the marketplace, I'm thinking, for example, nursing in the NHS, there are still some organisations that either choose to ignore the rules or indeed willfully test them to their extreme with, as we put here, often inconceivable outcomes. What we're finding is that there are some organisations that have sprung up that are making determinations on behalf of customers and paying individuals gross, which is ultimately putting the hiring management community, the end user customers, at risk. So there are some issues out there that you need to be aware of. Similarly, however, there are others that choose to work closely with their customers and working with them hand in hand in support of the rules, making sure that customers can indeed comply with the reform and the tax law as set out by the HMRC, achieving the intended outcomes across the different worker populations in terms of PSE workers and beyond. What about contractors? Well, as you'd expect, contractors continue to look to have their status properly tested in order to potentially establish themselves as outside of IR35 where appropriate. So many contractors, many PSCs operate in a manner in which they provide their services where they expect to be treated as IR35 because they comply with the tax law, and therefore they expect their hiring managers, their organisations that utilise their services to treat them in that fashion in order to be able to continue to provide their services in that manner. As such, also, during the time of implementation around April last year, many contractors look to set out how to improve their working practices so that they can actually define themselves more clearly as contractors and therefore are more likely to be deemed to be out of scope of IR35. What we obviously found is where blanket in-scope determinations were implemented, many individuals, many contractors, many providers chose to work only with those public bodies that actually offer a testing regime, i.e. on an assignment-by-assignment basis. And where organisations didn't offer that, they moved wholesale across into the private sector where, in the face of very robust demand, highly skilled contractors that are in high demand clearly can choose where to ply their trade and often move across to the private sector in the face of those blanket in-scope determinations, and Clive will touch on that as we go through his case study. Others obtained a rate increase to compensate for the net pay reduction, so if there was a blanket in-scope determination instigated, obviously it has a significant impact on the take-home pay of these providers, these contractors, and therefore they sought compensation for that. Some, on the other hand, accepted the tax deductions or indeed were converted to employees. Now, this is a question of where you look in terms of the skill set. So those that traditionally operate in a highly specialist marketplace and provide their services as contractors were able to move to the private sector, but those where they were limited in their choices, so for example nurses, were required to take those tax deductions on the chin and operate either in a PAYE basis or pay the tax NI through different means. Others simply left the market altogether because it just became not worth it anymore, where they were fed up with being treated indifferently in terms of having arbitrary in-scope determinations made on their behalf without consideration around the true status of the assignments. As I mentioned earlier, some work through potentially illegal solutions, such as nurses, which will, in the face of HMRC scrutiny, prove to be problematic for the sector, both reputationally and also financially. As a result of all of these things, it's become much harder to attract skilled talent to work in the public sector. In terms of demand at the moment, there is the lowest unemployment since 1975. Demand is robust across both private and public sectors as all organisations seek to transform and change how they deliver their services. On that basis, it's become much harder for the public sector to attract skilled talent in the face of this demand. So what have been some of the outputs around the implementation of IR35 reform? This is the outcomes, the results of a survey carried out by Contractor Calculator. Now, we must point out that it's a survey across contractors who clearly have a position to present, but it is interesting in its insights in terms of some of the scale of the impact. So, for example, 76% of departments lost highly skilled contractors. 71% of projects were cancelled or delayed as a result of losing those contractors. And again, Clive will have some views on this. 47% of projects lost at least a quarter of their contractors. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, 27% of public sector contractors actually left the public sector and moved across to the private sector in the face of robust demand, where people have the luxury of choices about where they work in this current marketplace. So as you can see, there was some significant impact as a result from the contractor point of view. And this indeed was backed by our own survey across our customers that we carried out with our salary survey, where 78% of our customers found it harder to attract skilled temporary or contract workers as a result of the implementation of the reform. And indeed, 25% of those found it much harder to attract the staff they need. So there's clear evidence on both sides of the fence, both from contractors but also across our customer community, about how this reform has affected the ability to attract skills into the public sector. One of the outputs also is nearly a quarter, 23%, of contractors now demand a higher rate from employers, from public sector hiring organisations, as a result of the changes in the reforms, in the implementation of these reforms. So, bottom line, it's resulted in increased costs, much more difficult hiring conditions, and increased risk to the successful delivery of objectives across public sector organisations hiring specialist contractor workforces. I'll now hand over to Clive, who's going to talk us through how he set about implementing the reform into his organisation.
Good afternoon. It's Clive Mills. I'm the Recruitment and Redeployment Manager at TfL, and it's been probably the biggest project that I've managed it. And at the beginning of the IR35 legislation, I thought, who could possibly be interested in tax? Surely this is a very dull topic, but actually it's been a really interesting project that we've run and a really fun project to get the team involved with. So I'd like to just tell you a little bit about TfL. We're the third largest employer in London, and we've got 27,000 employees, a few key points there, 270 stations, and just going down to the bottom, we had 3,200 temporary workers in December 2015, and that's come right down to 1,500, so a huge reduction. IR35 has certainly played a part in that, but as I'll go through, also our transformation program and headcount reduction program has also played a part. We had 1,672 PSCs before IR35 cut in, and we think we have something between 2,000 and 4,000 statement of work workers via framework agreements, but of course we hire people on the framework agreements rather than individually, so we're never too sure of that number. So moving on, I wanted to share the timeline of the project, and I think one of the things that we benefited from was early on having a steering group in place with senior leaders on it. So we had a head of direct tax and our principal lawyer, as well as myself and commercial lead. So it helped to have that steering group in place early because we had questions fielded. We could field from directors, from FOI requests that we all have to address. So that was early in 2016. Then we responded to consultation and talked to HMRC about the impact of implementing this, and I guess the dangers of a two-tier workforce where we would have more difficulty recruiting some of our key roles because of the bleed to the private sector. And then we moved on to, I'm going to jump through to October, November, where we did analyse our roles. So that was another key step for us. Who have we got on site? And how many of these roles are business critical? We had the autumn statement, the announcement by the Chancellor in November, and then really the main work happened between November and January. So we had about 4 months November and January, and then through to April. All in all, about 4 months to implement. So, the journey that we undertook. At the beginning, we were thinking about everyone being inside. I think that's been a common theme in the public sector, and certainly the NHS took that approach early on. Everyone should be inside. Surely that minimises the tax risk. So we thought about that for a number of reasons. But I think over the Christmas period, as a steering group, we thought, now hang on, we've got true contractors working, particularly in the IT department, and our white-collar engineering workers. Is that really the right thing to do? And so we formulated a more blended approach. So that was part of our journey. That was an important part of our journey, is looking at our workforce. Then the second point, if we can just get back to that slide, we looked, the IT department were particularly worried about losing key talent over to the private sector, over to Canary Wharf, and so we engaged with them. We had early engagement with Hays. Hays are our MSP, and having them on site and partnering with them was very helpful, and they helped us a lot with the data and the thinking with this. I think Matt has talked about the HMRC tool. It was being a blunt tool. It was a basic tool at that time. It certainly moved on now, but we looked at whether we could do some more comprehensive testing, have a more comprehensive tool, which we did. We worked on that with Hays. At the bottom, we gave the business 4 options for our temporary workers. Convert to PAYE, so we talked to the managers in these terms, undertake an IR35 test, or hire the worker, take on the worker as an employee, or end the contract. I wanted to show this slide because it shows, this was at April last year, after the IR35 exercise, what happened to those 1,672 limited company workers. And in the blue, you can see a large proportion, 33% PAYE. In the pink, we've got 30% leaving TfL, and 20% at that time were outside of IR35, and that's gone up. That's gone up a little bit since then. But those 20% are key skills in IT and engineering. The next slide, I don't want to go into too much detail, but suffice to say, it takes a bit of thinking about the extra costs that have to be paid with IR35. The Treasury will take at least around 13.8% ENIC, Employers' National Insurance. You've got the levy to think about, which is currently 1%, and you've got pension, stakeholder pension, currently 1%, going up to 2% in April this year. So the two the left hand and the middle bar chart show what life was like before IR35. The same charge rate for this illustrative role of a developer. But if you decide to pay costs, make sure that that worker takes home the same amount, it's going to cost, on the right-hand side, the right-hand bar, you can see the charge goes up to £481 instead of £425, so £83 more. It's just an illustration. Now, we didn't pay extra for our roles because we didn't have the money to pay extra, and it was not the right decision. So moving on, if you wanted to look at that slide in more detail, it's available, how we reached those calculations. So the problems, as has been mentioned, the landscape was the lowest unemployment since 1975, and we were finding it difficult to hire the right type of workers anyway. So skill shortage, financial constraints in place in the public sector, right across the board, and we've been going through an organisational change programme which has impacted headcount and costs. So it was IR35 plus organisational change for us. So that was the two together. I've mentioned the talent bleed. One of our areas we struggled with was our train maintainers, our workshops, keeping the underground trains and the projects moving, the upgrade projects. We were in prime position at the time where people would come to work for us above other companies. We did lose that prime place to private sector train companies, so that was a struggle for us. We've recovered it, but it's taken a long time. We're not number one in that space at this time. So managers and directors were concerned about this. For example, aren't we isn't this tax avoidance, moving people over to limited companies, doing all this compliance, isn't it tax avoidance? And we were very clear with our head of direct tax, who said TfL is not implementing anything that is tax avoidant or tax aggressive. And I think it took us time to get that message across, that actually work with us, with the compliance, with the testing, and you will be tax compliant. But if we don't get it right, if we don't get our testing right, if we don't do this properly, then of course it could be deemed as tax avoidance. So we were careful and it took us time to get that message across. But having the senior level tax expert involved was important. We needed to get buy-in. Yes, we need to get buy-in from the IT team. So what happened here is the IT team at one point were thinking, just as I've explained, is this tax avoidance? If I've been working with this person for the last couple of years on a project, what's really changing? Will I not be questioned by HMRC? Will I be liable? Could I be disciplined if I don't get this right? So we needed to provide reassurance that this was the agreed way with the steering group to go. And we did win over the senior managers by giving presentations and workshops and holding meetings with them. Maybe not applicable to other parts of the public sector, but there was a changing political landscape. We had a new mayor and different priorities, it's fair to say, in terms of looking at taking on some of the workers and reducing the number of personal service companies. Brexit also in the mix. And let's go on to the next slide about the approach that we've now adopted. So what's happening now? We classify roles up front. We know which roles are generally inside of IR35, and the call centre jobs are always going to be inside of IR35 because of the supervision, the direction, the control there. And then roles that could be tested, like IT developers, like engineers. We partner with Hays, and we conduct these tests. We've got a comprehensive test, many more questions than the HMRC test, and we do that 6 monthly to make sure that things haven't creeped, there's no creep, there's no slippage there. The good thing about this test is it does keep an audit trail of the sign-off from the manager. And the question we ask managers is, considering the responses to the questions from your contractor, do you or will you work with your contractor in this way? And that sometimes means a change of culture. Just for one example, the contractor not being in the office 5 days a week, the contractor being able to work on their own terms to deliver the outputs. We ran working with your contractor workshops covering all of these topics. We had drop-in clinics to help workers, help managers complete the test. And I guess it tightened up the whole concept of having agreed outcomes for contractors rather than, I guess, what we will try to avoid, the body shopping approach. We keep a file for each worker in case of HMRC inspection, and we work very closely with the commercial team for our statement of work and commercial contracts to make sure that we focused on the job titles and getting that right as well. So What lessons have we learned? Engage early, I think, was one of them. Work with our suppliers. It was, I think at the time there was lots of questions around, but actually talk to your suppliers. I put here, form a brave steering group. I think at the time, it's fair to say, I think we were fairly brave in some of the approaches we took. The NHS arguably took a less brave approach, but there's different views on this and different journeys. But have a steering group that know the law and know the business and what could be done. So then, the data. I think one of the things that was mistakes that we made early on was talking about having specialist roles, but actually we changed that to business critical roles because, for example, a train maintainer is not necessarily a specialist role. It can be a semi-skilled role, but absolutely critical to making sure our trains are maintained and running on the network. The BBC were helpful in understanding their approach to freelancers, and they have several thousand of them. Network Rail, HS2, working in unionised environments. It was good to be with them and to talk about their challenges and their approach. And just going on, being clear, lots of questions about tax. You know, can I carry on as an LLP? Just carry on as normal. In fact, for us, we decided no, that wasn't the case. It wasn't something we would allow. Or, can my agency pay the tax and I carry on as a limited company? Well, for us, that wouldn't have worked. That didn't work, but it might work for some. So let's go on to the next one, and just calling out a few of these points. Point 2, a lot of press interest, FOIs. We have regular FOI requests from interested parties and professional bodies. And then the fourth point, very few workers, we talk about substitution, will actually substitute. But we've certainly had a few, and task substitution is something that we push. Can you move some of your work, if it's busy, to somebody else in your company or somebody else to cover some of your work? So we've encouraged that. I think it's fair to say the gap between the private and the public sector is not quite as broad as we thought. But the last point there, we are going to introduce for some roles a two-tier rate card. We have a rate card, so a min, mid and a max point for every role. But we think that for some engineering roles and IT roles, we will have a different rate in 2018. So finally, what would we have done differently? Well, apart from starting earlier and taking a little bit more time to explore the blended approach of inside and outside, I think we would have liked to have had more agreed outcomes in place, so a document for every worker, every contractor, being really clear about their outcomes in place. It's something we've done since IR35. That's been a cultural change. FAQs, so many questions, and the reality of it is getting some FAQs out was something I think we would have done earlier rather than trying to cover every scenario. So that took actually a lot of effort to produce. And as I've said, being more confident earlier on. So I hope that's been of some use in understanding our journey. I'm going to hand over now to Steve.
Thank you, Clive. So where are we now? Again, just to recap, we're talking about contractors who operate through their own personal service companies, as Clive has alluded to there. The rules are actually called off-payroll, and it can apply to things like LLPs or even self-employed contractors. I've made reference to umbrellas and to recruiters. Those are entirely around payments to the personal service company worker. The people who pay the personal service workers are called fee payers, and it's with them that the risk remains in terms of tax liabilities should there be a problem. The first thing, I guess, is that the reforms will not be reversed. Again, we've already referred to the fact that this is going to be extended into the private sector. So there has to be a level playing field in terms of public and private, so that this will continue and be extended. Some organisations continue to make uninformed decisions based on a poor understanding of the intent of the rules. Again, Clive has already accurately explained how some organisations feel that they are somehow complicit in tax avoidance by adhering to the rules. That is not the way it is. The rules, when they're adopted as they're intended, is not tax avoidance. It's merely complying with the legislation. Indeed, conversations I've had with the senior tax inspectors who've been the policy leads on this have said that they really couldn't cope with the admin if organisations made blanket decisions to find people inside IR35, because the vast majority of contractors would end up with tax refunds. And quite frankly, that would be a nightmare in terms of admin for HMRC. Many contractors were denied the opportunity to work in the public sector by the fact that these blanket decisions were taken, that they were inside, and that was something that they couldn't live with on the basis that they had very carefully built up a working life and chosen this particular way to work, and as a consequence of that, were accurately outside IR35. Again, these new rules did not change any of the criteria to find out whether you were inside or outside IR35. They merely passed the responsibility on to a third party, i.e. the engager, to make that decision for them. There are still some issues that are kicking around in terms of the implementation of the public sector rules, and again, Matt has referred to the fact that there are issues in the NHS and NHS trusts. It's not unique to them, but the problem essentially is where organisations are making decisions that workers are inside IR35, passing on that decision and assuming that tax will be deducted as a consequence of that. What has happened in some instances is recruiters and umbrellas who are, let's just say, taking advantage of these rules, or rather disregarding some of the clear intentions of the rules, are then, without any reference to the original engager, reversing their decisions and paying people gross. And this is a clear intention to try and steal workers, I guess, from the compliant organisations that are out there abiding by the rules. HMRC have now started with some post-implementation activity. I've heard of a couple of instances where they are actually auditing some public sector authorities with some heavy emphasis on the use of a substitution clause and the implementation of a substitution clause. They've also said to those public sector bodies that any inaccurate decisions will mean that they will end up with employment status reviews. Now, by deferring the decision in terms of implementation in the private sector, the uneven playing field that currently exists is likely to last a bit longer than we'd hoped it would. Right now, the government have said that they will consult in 2018, and they will produce legislation thereafter once that consultation process has been completed. When that legislation will actually start, we don't know, but as again, Clive has accurately kind of portrayed, early engagement is better than late engagement. The public sector will definitely remain, unfortunately, at a competitive disadvantage to the private sector in terms of attracting talent, because they have these what can appear at first blush, certainly, quite complicated rules, and certainly as far as contractors are concerned, rules that put them at a disadvantage to their private sector colleagues.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So, moving on then. So, what can the public sector do in competing for talent? So, in summary, in short, the reform is here to stay. The distorted market is going to exist for at least another 15 months, through until April 2019, possibly longer, subject to the consultation that has been announced, or is yet to be announced actually, and yet to be implemented. And therefore, that competitive disadvantage is going to persist for the foreseeable future, at least. So, where are we? We find ourselves now where there's a three-tier customer base that has emerged in terms of where Hays works extensively across the public sector. We find a myriad, indeed polar opposites, of customers who have responded in different ways. So we've got those that use contractors in a compliant manner and apply the rules as intended by HMRC, i.e. CTFL, as Clive has described. the skill sets, the niche business critical skill sets, as Clive termed them, have been identified. Tests are applied using an external third-party assessment service that Hays provides, and therefore they continue to utilize and access this hard-to-find talent. There are some organizations that have chosen to instigate a in-scope default position, but have an exceptions process whereby when it gets hard or difficult to find people, which is often most of the time, they then instigate an exceptions process in order to be able to access that talent. And then finally, there's the third tier, where there are those that continue to make blanket in-scope determinations. And I get the feeling there was a lot of organizations out there that were sitting there waiting for the private sector to have the reform implemented and also to create that level playing field. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen for the foreseeable future, therefore they must grasp that nettle of change as a result. So let's just think about the impact and the outputs of that. Should organizations implement blanket in-scope determinations, as Clive has already alluded to, that there's a potential for increasing costs because obviously contractors will have to be secured at more expensive rates. There's the inability to attract skills because of migration to the private sector, because these business critical skill sets have the ability to operate elsewhere. And there's the inability to actually derive the best value for money from these contractors who are more than willing to provide their services in a manner that is compliant, that is outside the scope of IR35 in providing their services, where they're accountable for delivery, their feet are against the fire, and they're very happy with that because that's what they set themselves up to do. And that offers obviously best value to those organizations that can utilize contractors in that manner. So Tier 1, those that operate in a manner where assignments are tested on an assignment by assignment basis, or business critical skill sets have been identified and services are provided in an out-of-scope tax compliant manner, they operate at a significant advantage because they retain access to that talent, to the best talent in the market that's in high demand, and they get the best outcomes at the best value for money as a result, i.e. their contractors are responsible for the services they provide and are accountable for delivery of services and functions and tasks. So let's just think about some of the things that Clive spoke about earlier in terms of the work that he did throughout implementation across Transport for London, and indeed what other customers are doing that Hays work with, that you could describe effectively as the best practice solution to the implementation of the reform. So first and foremost, the common theme that we found was that customers have worked really closely with their executive teams to make sure they fully understand the reform. What we found at the outset was lots of organisations took a very knee-jerk reaction to what was deemed to be or considered to be fairly complex legislation, and therefore the most risk-free or risk-averse approach was simply to blanket in-scope determine across the contractor workforce. However, those more forward-thinking executive teams, indeed those HR and tax teams that work closely with them, were able to advise that actually tax compliance is not tax avoidance. It's simply adhering to the rules as set out by the HMRC and ensuring that PSCs are used in a fashion that allows them to provide their services in a tax-compliant manner. Part of the journey around that was to understand their role types and business-critical skill sets that they required in order to deliver their services. For example, IT, where it became massively important that they understood the constraints around the market, the demand across the private sector, the nature of the markets they're operating in order to make sure they could continue to access that hard-to-find talent, the business-critical skill sets. And indeed, they assessed the impact on those skill sets of not effectively implementing the reform. So what I mean by that is wholesale departure of business-critical contractors to the private sector and other organisations, and indeed the cost impact of having to utilise these contractors inside IR35, where they become liable for employers' national insurance and apprentice levy, as well as the potential uplift in price, in day rates that contractors will demand. So what they've done is they've implemented approaches that adhere to the rules, that allows them to access that hard-to-find talent, and in a tax-compliant fashion. Part of that process may have been, often, review of the working practices. So what I mean by that is, how is the contractor treated by the hiring manager in the provision of their services, in the delivery of their tasks and projects? And there's some change management required there, some cultural change that Clive alluded to earlier, about utilisation of contractors, also on an ongoing and consistent fashion throughout the life of their assignments. As I mentioned earlier, tests are carried out on an assignment-by-assignment basis, either using the HMRC test, despite its limitations, which we'll touch on, or indeed a third-party provider in terms of IR35 expert test assessment, which is again is a service that Hays provides to TfL under our MSP. The limitations of the HMRC tests themselves, it's been an evolving proposition since April and has continued to change throughout, but it does still often throw up an indeterminate status when the questions are answered, which obviously doesn't help anybody when seeking to make a tax-compliant decision as to the utilisation of a particular contractor on an assignment, which is often why customers and organisations go to third-party assessment tools. They've also worked very actively with their hiring management community to help them understand what the test is asking. It's veiled in difficult-to-understand language. Hiring managers are concerned around the potential risk around signing off, as Clive alluded to earlier. So they've worked really hard in helping their hiring managers understand how to utilise contractors and the nature in which they need to be utilised in order to be able to essentially pass the test, if you like, in terms of answering it appropriately in assessing the IR35 assessment. And finally, they've worked closely with recruitment specialists that understand this legislation. Recruiters, as you can imagine, deal with tax change and compliance issues on an ongoing basis. It's an ever-changing landscape, and we're well used to dealing with it. And as such, we're well used to helping our customers navigate some of these issues. So at a practical level, what does that mean? Well, customers that use in an ad hoc fashion infrequently low-volume contractors can and should adopt an assignment-by-assignment testing regime, whether it's identifying those skill sets that are business critical or indeed understanding those skill sets which are more often than not in scope of IR35, being able to differentiate between the two, and then for those niche skill sets, those business critical skill sets, they should be testing on an assignment-by-assignment basis. Again, whether in-house using the HMRC tool or indeed an expert supplier externally providing a testing service such as the one that Hays provides. So that's one option for low-volume users. High-volume users utilise multiple hundreds, or indeed say 50, 100 contractors plus. We've seen a trend in the marketplace in the last 9 months to move towards managed service provision, where specialist recruiters partner with them in helping to assess the risk and manage and mitigate the risk of the provision of contractors providing their services in an IR35 compliant fashion. What's the benefit of doing so? Well, you get complete visibility of your workforce, you manage the risk associated with IR35 and indeed other compliance issues, and you continue to be able to access the best talent. These skills-scarce environments where contractors have the luxury of choices around where they ply their trade, it's being able to access that talent in a compliant fashion and managing that process in a visible way. Often what we're seeing also is customers looking towards how to actually derive the best value for money through the use of wider recruitment and resourcing partnerships. And one of the reasons why organisations often use temporary workers is because it's the inability to attract permanent talent. And what we're now finding is that organisations are seeking to adopt approaches that utilise the means by which to reach talent through specialist recruiters across both permanent and temporary hiring landscapes. And finally, let's think about the outputs of these kind of approaches. Well, as I mentioned earlier, those Tier 1 customers that appropriately assess IR35 status at the outset are benefiting from access to a much wider talent pool than those that use blanket in-scope determinations. So my rather clumsy diagram, what I'm seeking to point out here is those that use ineffective approaches have a much smaller candidate pool to choose from than those that operate in a best practice fashion that gives them the ability to attract a much wider, from a much wider pool of candidates in order to meet their requirements. What else? Well, they also enjoy an improved time to hire, much faster IR35 assessment, much quicker engagement, and much faster onboarding as a result. We all know that public sector organisations struggle with onboarding due to various processes and compliance issues. Those that have partnered with specialist recruiters enjoy a much better, much improved time to hire result when they can reach out to this talent and assess it in a tax-compliant fashion very, very quickly. And as a result also of the changing in working practices, you see much more cost-effective engagement. So there's no inflation of pay rates to account for the additional impact of tax and NI burden on contractors who might otherwise be deemed to be out of scope of IR35, but for whatever reason are deemed to be in scope and therefore suffering a much greater tax burden. Customers are often, organisations are often having to therefore offset that cost and increase their pay rates as a result. And indeed, now those that operate in this fashion are enjoying a much better value for money, much clearer focus on the outputs of engagement, much greater accountability for delivery, much better value for money from their contractor workforce. And finally, of course, they get risk mitigation, clear accountability and responsibility for assessment in terms of the clear audit trail that's created as a result of using these types of approaches. Despite all of this, Due to the skill scarcity, however, due to the point we were making earlier about demand across robust markets, low unemployment, skill scarcity, it still remains really challenging for public sector customers, and they have to still work really hard to attract talent. However, those that do operate in this fashion are enjoying a much more significant competitive advantage when compared to their peers in that war for talent. So, to sum up, finally, and then we'll take some questions. Key learnings and recommendations. So we're in a distorted market. It's going to remain so for at least 15 months. That's the way it's going to be. And as a result, unfortunately, public sector organisations will have to work harder to attract that specialist talent to work in public sector organisations than ever before. To remind ourselves, to best position yourself to do so, work closely with your executive team to understand it is possible to use contractors outside the scope of IR35 whilst complying with the rules. Assess your demand of areas of demand, the impact on key skill sets, those business critical skills that Clive alluded to. Review blanket approaches originally implemented due to really a lack of understanding or resource around what at first sight appears to be a complex piece of legislation but actually is easily managed in the right circumstances. Implement effective management of the reform that allows adherence to the rules, that allows you then in turn to access that talent. And also this should include testing on an assignment-by-assignment basis, again, whether using the tool or a third party, and work with your hiring management community in terms of that change in culture and environment about how to treat contractors and how to improve working practices to allow them to provide their services in this fashion. And finally, partner with recruitment specialists that understand the legislation, that are well used to implementing change across the sector, and they can help you navigate these issues in a reasonably straightforward fashion to allow you to achieve that tax compliance whilst accessing that hard-to-find talent. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to take some questions that have been busily coming throughout the presentation. And the first one is, what are the limitations of the HMRC test, and indeed what are the benefits of using third-party test services? Steve.
Shall I take that? Yeah, okay, man, I'll take that one. In terms of the HMRC online tool, I think the best description is inflexible. The decisions on whether someone is inside or outside R35 is not in legislation. It's to be found in a whole plethora of tax cases from which various rules have evolved. And the decisions in those cases are sometimes very borderline. There are very nuanced decisions need to be taken or judgments need to be taken. And essentially the very blunt HMRC questionnaire is something that appears more binary than nuanced. So the outcomes are often not extreme necessarily, but with the HMRC tweaking of the tool in a certain fashion, there are some indeterminate statuses, a number of indeterminate statuses, but if there's any doubt, generally speaking, the contractor will be found to be inside R35. That doesn't necessarily reflect the accuracy of the situation. What you really need to have done is to have the same questions that are asked on the online tool, and then in my view, and this is where the third-party experts come in, because we're looking essentially at those first two questions being the flip side of the same coin, is some kind of human intervention that sits above the whole questionnaire and says, let's look at this in a holistic sense and find out whether Steve Witts is inside or outside R35 based on the questions and on the answers to the questions, and also the kind of feel overview you get from the nature of the job and the nature of the way he conducts himself. HMRC have a helpline which is supposed to help you. Unfortunately, it's not as helpful as you'd like it to be. In fact, we're hearing stories about people ringing up asking for assistance and the operators saying that they're not allowed to assist with the decision-making process. You can consult them, you can send them facts and information about a particular hire, but the response time for that is between 2 and 4 months. So back to Matt's point about spontaneity, there is no easy way to get an immediate decision from HMRC other than through their online tool, which, as I say, at best is a default to inside R35. As I say, I'll allude it to the private side and to the experts that are out there as being the flip side of the same coin. There are a number of organisations out there, one of whom we partner with. This is predominantly what they do. Some of them, it's all they do. And through that sort of sole focus, they have built up a massive reputation and sophistication in looking at these things. So much so that they are absolutely convinced of the merits and the accuracy of their decisions, and indeed offer indemnities to those who often rely on these decisions. So confident are they. Certainly the one we partner with has a long track record of disputes with HMRC, and the number of disputes that they have not succeeded with runs to the fingers on one hand. And as far as HMRC is concerned, it's not a great position that they've got with them. So I guess, yeah, HMRC tool is inflexible. The third-party experts are one expert in that field, because that's all they do, and have this nuanced view of human intervention plus questions.
And the benefits, Steve, of using the third party?
Well, certainly the fact that they're so confident in their decision-making process means that they're prepared to give indemnities must be reassuring to the hiring organisation. And I would say, yes, one, the expertise, and two, peace of mind.
And there's a related question, Clive, I know you're wishing to jump in here on one of your own, but there's a related question: does the third-party tool cost more money? I can only speak for the service that Hayes provides, in that we don't charge our customers for the provision of that service. It's funded in a different way, but what it does mean is that the customer then manages the risk and also gets complete visibility and audit trail around it. So it works for the customer in that fashion from a commercial point of view also. Clive, I know you want to jump in because there was a question about how do we manage the internal constraints and tensions between the different stakeholders, procurement, HR, finance, and exec, etc. If you'd like to talk us through how you did that.
Yes, a question come up on the feed about that, and who would be best placed to implement the project? Well, as I said, we had a steering group with commercial, which is the same as procurement at TfL, so the commercial team, the HR team, and then with legal and tax representatives. So the steering group was helpful. The actual implementation, we did a joint implementation with HR services, so the shared service centre of HR and the commercial team, with HR taking more of a lead on agency workers, which I've talked mainly about agency workers, but also the commercial team taking a lead on the framework, the statement of work, the purchase order side of things. So agency workers, HR, commercial and procurement for that side. But of course there may not be that division in your organisation. Certainly HR, as HR, we took a strong lead because we're used to dealing with workers, we're used to dealing with contingent workers, and we have teams and I guess the mindset and the culture of doing that. So we did take quite a strong lead in HR.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Clive. Steve, I've got a couple more technical ones around the testing regime in IR35 itself. Does the HMRC assume that everyone should be inside the scope of IR35?
No. I think I referred earlier when we looked at the future. Having spoken with the policy lead at HMRC on this particular issue, he was horrified at the prospect that there would be blanket decisions out there finding people inside IR35, because lots of them aren't. As I say, the new rules merely change the focus in terms of the decision, as opposed to the technical merits of whether someone's inside or outside IR35. So an organisation being very conservative and saying everyone's inside IR35, as far as HMRC is concerned, merely means that come the end of the year, when those people submit self-assessment returns, there are an absolute wealth of tax refunds that need to be made to the individuals concerned, and that is not something they particularly welcomed, because this was aiming to try and minimise the kind of admin for them, and actually a blanket inside IR35 decision would increase that admin.
Brilliant, thanks, Steve. And related to that, in terms of the testing approach itself, what is an office holder, and what if I have a contractor covering a perm position?
We asked HMRC for their definition of an office holder, and understandably they didn't want to commit to it on the basis that we would take, the kind of tax-paying population, would take too narrow a view of it. An office holder is an official post that exists outside of the organisation, and here you're looking at board positions, so executive directors, non-executive directors. These positions have to exist in any corporate. Just because you have a title, so I'm head of tax and treasury, just because a contractor covered my position doesn't mean that becomes an office holder because I have a title. It's merely what I do. Some organisations don't have a head of tax and treasury, but a contractor could be fulfilling essentially the same functions I perform, but in a small organisation. So what you're looking at in terms of office holders is board positions, company secretaries, assistant company secretaries. These things have to exist in any corporate because there are rules that say they must, and they are office holders. On a related point, if I can extend it slightly, one of the big things that you can't do in terms of contractors is to ensure, or is to have them have a managerial responsibility, because that surely ties them in as employees or quasi-employees, which means that they would find it very difficult to be found outside IR35 in any assessment.
Steve, that's something we looked at, and we check that our contractors who are outside of IR35 don't have that line management responsibility. We check the org chart and we do that as part of our checking.
Perfect.
There was a question about umbrella companies. What about umbrella companies? How do they work? Is there a difference between umbrellas and PAYE?
Let me explain. Umbrella companies exist essentially as payroll bureaus. Some of them do some related recruitment work as well, but they're certainly very distinct from the personal service companies that we're looking at the moment. So what we're essentially looking at, and the people to whom these rules predominantly apply, is Steve Witts, the contractor, operating as Steve Witts Limited. These rules apply squarely to him. If he was working for Clive at TfL and it was decided that he was in scope, then, actually, based on what Clive said earlier, that wouldn't necessarily apply. Steve might be put on the payroll. But if TfL contemplated the possibility that Steve was inside R35, then either TfL or the recruitment company that supplied Steve, it could be Hayes, would arrange to pay Steve and to sort out the deductions that are now appropriate to Steve's position as inside R35. So there's a separation here. The contractor is one person, the limited company, legal entity. The umbrellas and the recruitment companies that pay Steve are entirely separate. And they are, back to a point I alluded to earlier, the fee payer in terms of the legislation. And if they are involved in the decision-making process, then and the rules are not appropriately applied, then it's the fee payer that is liable to pick up some debt in terms of the unpaid tax.
Thanks, Steve. It's coming up now to the full hour, so I'm going to draw it to a close. We've been inundated with questions, so those of you who unfortunately not had opportunity to have your questions answered by the team here, what we will do is we'll make a note of them and we will issue an FAQ document as a result of this webinar that will also be published alongside this webinar and a recording of it, which you can, as you can see on the screen now, is going to be accessible on hayes.co.uk. So all that remains, if I may, is to say thank you so much to Steve and to Clive for joining us and talking about their experiences of the implementation of the reform. Much appreciated, and I'm sure by the audience as well. And thank you to everybody for joining. I hope you found it very useful.